We are recording this for the upcoming Budapest Forum in Budapest, September 18 and 19. My name is Dániel Rényi. I'm a journalist for 444.hu. My guest today is Anne Applebaum, worldwide known journalist, columnist for The Atlantic, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and author of numerous books, recently Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Hi, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm happy to join by video.
Can you tell us what made you write this book? What was this new phenomenon that you discovered and you decided to write this about?
So it's not entirely new. It's been building for a decade. The book describes a network, and it's a network of states that are not joined ideologically. So we're talking about communist China, nationalist Russia, theocratic Iran, but also North Korea, Venezuela, Burma, and a handful of others. And these are autocratic states whose leaders or whose ruling parties want to rule without any checks and balances, without independent courts, without any kind of media, without any kind of accountability, without any transparency. And they therefore have come to object to the language of accountability and transparency. So they work together when they can, both inside their countries and around the world, to fight against the reality and also the ideas of the liberal democratic world. So checks and balances, rule of law, rights, human rights, anything that would make them reveal more about how much money they have, or would put some kind of check on their power. And they cooperate in the financial sphere. They do the kind of quasi-state companies of one country invest in the quasi-state companies of another. They cooperate in terms of surveillance technology. They share that. They watch one another. They learn from one another's repressive techniques, whether legal repression or psychological repression. And increasingly, they also begin to cooperate militarily. So you've seen in Russia's imperial war in Ukraine, you see drones coming from Iran. You see ammunition coming from North Korea. The Chinese have enabled the sale of parts and components that help the Russians build their defense industry. So they work together. They support one another. They support the weaker regime. So in Venezuela, it's really the autocracies of the world that keep it surviving. It would have fallen a long time ago were it not for Russian and Chinese and Iranian help evading sanctions. You can see a similar phenomenon in Belarus.
You said that it started approximately 10 years ago. This sort of new process was there something particular that happened at that time that that started this sort of new kind of autocratic cooperation?
So you can look at two things. One is in Russia, the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014, in which a movement that demanded transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption pushed a corrupt president out of the country, took over, held real democratic elections. I think for Putin, this was a kind of, this was exactly what he's afraid of. He's afraid that people motivated by those ideals will unseat him. And then you actually had at a similar moment in China around 2013, you had the rise of Xi Jinping, who was a different kind of Chinese leader, who's also seeking to rule without any even internal Chinese Communist Party checks on his abilities. It's in 2013, the Chinese Communist Party published a document which has the wonderful name of Document Number 9. And Document Number 9 lists the perils facing the Chinese Communist Party, and number 1 is Western constitutional democracy. That's the thing that the communists fear the most, as the idea that could be the most destabilizing. And of course, they fear it not just because it's the idea that governs the democratic world, but also because it's the ideal that has motivated their own opposition, especially the Hong Kong democracy movement. So you begin to see the larger dictatorships become aware of the degree to which the power of human rights, accountability, and the rule of law are beginning to could be a threat to their particular form of dictatorial power.
Can you give us maybe a few examples, at least one or two, countries that are actually following this path, that they started to come after Russia or China in this sense and started to use these new kind of technologies in order to maintain power?
Well, an excellent example is Hungary. Another excellent example is Georgia. I'll start with Georgia, since maybe we'll get on to Hungary in a minute. But Georgia is a country that whose population pushed very hard for integration into Europe a few years back. But you've had it's a kind of multiple attack, starting with a law that would effectively could be used against any kind of civic organizers or any kind of legitimate opposition. This is known as it's technically a foreign aid law, but we know that these kinds of laws are used, especially in the post-Soviet world, but also in Africa and Asia, as a tool of repression against. Really, it can be used almost against any group that a regime doesn't like. And you saw mass demonstrations in Georgia over the summer against that law. And you're about to see a very ugly election in Georgia, where the ruling party will do what it can to cheat, essentially, find ways to buy votes, find ways to use violence to frighten the supporters of the opposition, find ways to split the opposition, and that's again with the purpose of making sure that they can rule in Georgia without being pushed aside. I mean, I think the important thing is that nowadays, democracies that fail don't usually fail because of a coup d'etat or tanks in the streets. They fail because a democratic leader is elected to power, and he then dismantles the democratic state. And actually, one of the first leaders to do that was Hugo Chavez. So this isn't a right wing or a left wing phenomenon. Even Ishvili in Georgia is also hard to say whether he's right wing or left wing. He's just a figure of deeply connected to the kleptocracy. And of course, in Hungary, you have Viktor Orban, who was also democratically elected, also a legitimate democratic leader, who then, upon winning power, began to push back against the democratic institutions in order to stay in power indefinitely. I mean, it's a known means of achieving power.
What is the significance of the upcoming U.S. election when we're looking at this Autocracy Inc.? How, if Trump wins, how would that affect these sort of hidden cooperations between these modern autocrats?
Yeah. So first of all, they're not hidden; they're mostly open. I mean, you can see them. And I should say, it's not a conspiracy. There's no secret room where they meet. I mean, we can see a lot of the cooperation. Certainly we can see the military cooperation. Russia and Iran helping Syria, as I said, Iran, North Korea, and China helping Russia and Ukraine. Those are we can see those things visibly. I mean, the U.S. is a fascinating case because Donald Trump is not somebody who has a real ideology. He's really interested in himself. He's a transactional figure who's interested in his power, his ego, his money. He's interested in staying out of jail. Those are his motivations for being in politics. And so certainly we can say that as leader of the United States of America, he would not lead a strong democratic alliance to push back against Russia and China. He would not end the kleptocratic system that has enriched so many, both criminals and dictators around the world. One of the arguments of my book is that some of what we need to do to fight back against this is internal. We need to end money laundering. We need to end the use of anonymous companies and anonymous property. Those are, the ways in which autocratic leaders store their money, and even in the city of London, where I am now. And he wouldn't lead a reform of the internet, and he would probably further corrupt the American system in giving power to very wealthy billionaires and oligarchs. I mean, those are his supporters, and that's more or less what he said he would do. There is also, of course, a risk that he would end the support for Ukraine. I don't think the Ukrainians would then stop fighting, because for them it's life and death. I mean, if they stop fighting, they'll cease to exist as a nation. But he could make the war a lot bloodier. He could make it more dangerous. That could mean eventually a security challenge for Poland, for Germany, even for Hungary. Any country on the borders of a Russian occupied Ukraine would immediately be in, would immediately have a new kind of security challenge. So he could be a dangerous selection if Kamala Harris wins. Harris hasn't been involved in foreign policy much, although as vice president, she's traveled a good deal. I've talked to her about Ukraine. I've talked to her about NATO. She's supportive of both. And she is also somebody who is, of course, a lawyer and was a prosecutor. She was the Attorney General of California. And so she's somebody who's interested in rule of law, who understands why rights are important. And so therefore her DNA is supportive of Western democracy, or democracy more broadly. It's not only Western; it's also Asian and African and South American. And so we would at least have with her a fighting chance of the survival of the democratic world.
Well, Viktor Orban is one of the few politicians who actually openly support Donald Trump's re-election. Actually, he supported him back in 2016 and ever since. Is this something very unique in international politics? Can you name someone else who's like so openly next to Trump and favors his re-election?
I mean, the odd thing is, and I would think very dangerous for Hungary, is being involved in U.S. elections at all. I mean, you don't intervene in the affairs of your allies, or you shouldn't, because of course the risk for Hungary, as happened in 2020, is that the team you're backing loses, and then you have a difficult relationship with the United States. So it's a very peculiar way to conduct politics. I don't think there are any other NATO members who openly back. Actually, they don't back. Neither do they back Trump, nor do they back Harris. It's not really done in the democratic world. I mean, Netanyahu a little bit, although which is very strange, given that the Biden administration has done more militarily for Israel than any American government in recent history. But Netanyahu himself is an illiberal leader who is seeking to create an illiberal regime in Israel as well, and so perhaps he sees that as sympathetic. I mean, I should say what Orban has done in terms of not just visiting Trump, that's legitimate to visit Trump. I mean, people do that, but in terms of his involvement with U.S. think tanks and with foundations is pretty unique. I don't know of any other foreign leader who's doing it. But of course, the Russians clandestinely fund pro-Trump and anti-Ukrainian propaganda in the United States. But I think Orban is the only one who does it openly.
Well, especially because, I mean, it's weird looking at the fact that he's the one who's very sensitive when it comes to national sovereignty. So he's always the first, to stand up when it comes to like someone's trying to influence Hungary's national interests.
Right. Well, he has no qualms about, he's intervened in Slovak elections. He played a role in the Polish elections, actually in October. In fact, he gave very bad advice to the then ruling party. It was one of the reasons why they lost. They ran a Hungarian style referendum alongside their election campaign, which was a failure. He's been involved in, to some extent, he's involved in U.S. elections as well. And it's a very odd practice. It's winning him a lot of enemies.
Yeah, when mentioning a hidden cooperation, I meant that there's a quote about the book when you say it's more about deals, not ideals, in between these autocrats.
Of course, they have economic relationships that are much more important than their ideological relations, because ideologically they're very different, right? I mean, they're left and right, and the Iranians are Islamic fundamentalists. So they have different goals, but they do have common financial interests. We're talking about a group of billionaires. So the leaders of Russia, the leaders of China, the leaders of Venezuela, the leaders of Iran, or at least the Revolutionary Guard in Iran. These are very, very rich people. And so they have money to protect, and they have money to hide. And they want to hide it from their public. The public is not allowed to know where the money comes from, or how they got it, or how much how much it is. And of course, the money, some of it is hidden, as I've said, in both offshore and in, in various ways in the democratic world, because of course, leaders of illiberal countries or of dictatorships know that they don't have rule of law. And so they prefer to keep their money in places that do, and in places where there are rights and where there is a legal system, which is of course terribly ironic.
Cutting back to Orban for a second, early July he visited Kiev and then Moscow, and then he went to Beijing, and after Beijing traveled to Mar-a-Lago to see Donald Trump in only a very short period of time, and called this sort of tour as a peace mission. What was the international echo after this?
There was almost no reaction. I mean, most people treated it as a piece of grandstanding. I mean, it was Orban doing some kind of performance. We didn't know whether it was on behalf of his electorate or maybe it was about raising money. I don't know. I mean, we don't know what it was for, but it had very little to do with peace, and it had no lasting impact. I mean, there's no echo of it. I suppose the only echo of it is that quite a number of meetings that in a normal EU presidency would be held in Hungary will not be, because Hungary is being boycotted by other EU leaders who were offended by by Orban's behavior. I mean, the president of the European Union is an honorary job. That it doesn't give you the right to represent the EU on the international stage. It doesn't give you the right to negotiate on behalf of the EU. And Orban pretended that it did somehow, and it looked very. It was unserious.
So what do you think should be done in order to tackle this sort of international cooperation?
So first of all, as I said in the book, I argue for shutting down kleptocracy, for making the stealing and the hiding of money more difficult than it is now. I have a longer argument about regulation of the internet, which I've actually written more about elsewhere, which is not to do with censoring the internet, but with giving people access to algorithms, giving people control of their own data, allowing people, right now we have a conversation space which is dominated by a very few people whose interest is in keeping us online as long as possible, and that means feeding us with emotion and anger and division. And of course, the autocratic world has taken advantage of that. So the Russians run information operations all the time. The Chinese are beginning to do so as well. They operate in Africa and Asia. They work together actually, and they put out similar messages. So I would say creating an internet that's more compatible with democracy is a piece of the story. And then I think also, thinking harder about what deterrence means. One of the reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine was that the Ukrainians were not armed, and the Russians didn't believe that the Western world or the democratic world would come to their aid. And so they assume, Putin believes his own propaganda. He thinks the West is divided and demoralized and, sexually degenerate, and that it wouldn't aid Ukraine, and that it did. Had we been more clear about what we would do, had Ukraine been admitted to NATO, or at least had Ukraine had a real security pact with the major European powers, then maybe the invasion wouldn't have happened. So we need to think in terms of deterrence. We need to be prepared for lawless violence. These are regimes who respect. They're seeking to change the language of human rights, to take it out of international treaties. And they seek to use violence abroad the same way they do at home. So we have the right to do whatever we want. We can invade our neighbors. We can, the Russians have set up concentration camps in occupied Ukraine. They have kidnapped children, Ukrainian children. Putin has already been, the International Criminal Court has already indicted Putin for this. They kidnap Ukrainian children. They take them to Russia. They change their identities. I mean, this is behavior that we haven't seen in Europe since the 1940s. 1930s, and they do that because they believe they enjoy impunity. We need to make sure that regimes like Russia and like China don't come to believe in that they have some awareness that the Western world or the democratic world will fight back.
There are also a few countries who are actually members of these sort of Western alliances and still follows these patterns we're talking about here. What could these institutions, meaning namely the European Union or the NATO, should do in order to secure or protect its interest?
So there are a lot of in-between countries that my book does not describe. It's not a Cold War. There's more than two sides. It's not just democracy versus dictatorship. I mean, there are other countries in between. There's some countries that play both sides. Turkey is one of them. Hungary is obviously one of them. The case of Hungary is very specific. It's a small country, very weak economically, that's seeking to play a kind of ideological role in supporting the far right, and the illiberal right, and maybe even in some cases the illiberal left, all over the world. And unfortunately, the European Union is not really set up to monitor the democracy of its own countries. It doesn't really have a procedure for excluding or expelling countries. I mean, my guess, my feeling though, is that people are becoming, there's a limit is being reached of how much it can be tolerated, and you'll see the EU moving perhaps to change its relation with Hungary soon. NATO is a little bit different. Hungary doesn't matter that much to NATO. I think Hungary is probably not included in conversations where people worry about secrecy or really worry about, the assumption is that the Hungarians would leak to the Russians. So they're not told everything, and they don't play an important military role anyway. But I mean, your question is a good one. I mean, there is an issue for how long a country that is openly supportive of dictatorship and who brings the kleptocratic and corrupt practices of the autocratic world right into the heart of Europe, how long that should be tolerated.
And Applebaum, thank you for being with us. Good luck for your new book, Autocracy, Inc.
My greetings to the Budapest Forum, too. Thank you so much.